Hi, wonderful people. I'm Leah. As a sociologist, University of Melbourne professor, founder of the Gender Equity Initiative, director of the Future of Work Lab, woman, wife, and mother, I've made it my life's mission to take down every ridiculous gender myth out there. Together, we'll deep dive into the research to get to the bottom of all these misperceptions that are holding all of us back. Don't worry, I've studied these types of questions for decades, and after publishing countless articles exactly on these topics, I know when they are nonsense or real truths. And I'm going to help you learn that too. So here we go. Let's do it. This is Misperceived. On today's podcast, we're going to talk about how many children should you have? There's a lot of discussion about how many children to have and what multiple children mean for your lives. How many children do you have? Do you have one? Do you want more than one? And if you had that second or that third baby, what did it do to your life? Was it easier? Did it make life more simple to have that second? There's this saying, right, that if you have one, it's the hardest transition. And then when you have two, you've already made the transition, so it all becomes easier. Did that happen for you? If you haven't had kids yet, were you one of many in your family? Are you the first, the second, or the third? If you were one of multiple, did it feel stressful or chaotic to have multiple children in the home? Or if you were the only child, did it feel kind of quiet and boring? How did it feel to you? I've told you this in the past, but I had one, and I had one for multiple reasons. But in large part, I only had one because children are expensive, they're time consuming. And if I'm totally honest with you, I had many other things to do with my life than have multiple children. My energy and my money needed to go to different areas, like making this podcast for you. And so having multiple children without any of the social supports like childcare or parental leave or flexible work or shorter hours or having family close by felt like a lot. It felt exhausting. And so I ended up with one. In part because I knew that one would require a lot of energy and two might require even more. Now, let me be clear. If you have multiple, that's wonderful. But if you only have one, that's okay too. Fertility is a very personal decision. And the question is, what do you do when you have multiple children? So one of the reasons why I ended up with one was I knew a lot of the research about what multiples do to parents' lives. And I'm going to share that research with you today. On this episode of Misperceived, we're going to unpack the misperception. Are children cheaper by the dozen? Is a second child less work than the first? And do second children make life more stressful for parents? Now, if you're a second child, don't panic. This is not terrible news, but let's talk a little bit about what the research shows. So there is this narrative that second children are less work, or that parents, take fewer photos, or they feed them more junk food, or with the second or the third, it's just like whatever's left over you get. I am the third, so I am the last of three. And that was a running joke, right? That with me, my parents were feeding me candy and McDonald's, and it's just like they didn't have the energy for the third child. And perhaps you're in a family where you have this running joke too, right? About that third children or second children are just kind of on the periphery. They're cruising around. They're doing whatever the older kids are doing. And there's this idea that the result of that is that second children are just less work than the first because, parents already know what they're doing. They've already made that transition. They understand how to change diapers. They know what's coming. They've had an experience on that. And there is some research that suggests this may be true. Let me tell you a little bit about this idea of role strain. So there's this theory coming through the social science research that role strain theory posits that individuals hold multiple roles. Now, this is not just tied to being a parent, right? You can imagine you right now are holding multiple roles in your life. You may be a student, you may be a worker, you may be a daughter, you may be a son, you may be a wife. You're going to hold a range of roles that sit within your role set. And all of these roles have different demands. So each role you take on has demands and resources that come with it. And when you put them all together, that sits within your role set. So you're carrying a role set with different roles with different demands. So some of these roles can be assigned to you by birth. You don't actually select into them. You end up in these roles. Just by being born, you end up in this role of child. Just by being born, you end up in this role of parent. So sometimes these transitions give you these assigned roles. And we know that within society that some roles have different values and expectations and social norms. So the role of mother, for example, has different social norms and expectations than the role of father. Now, of course, you can challenge these roles. You don't have to step into them, you don't have to believe them, you don't have to enact them. Gender roles are gender roles. But the problem is that often they get embedded within institutions. So even if you personally reject aspects of your gender roles or aspects of the role of being the ideal worker, or you're challenging these roles, the institutions in which you're operating are going to reinforce them and try to push you into the role. So that is how gender roles work, right? You get assigned some sort of role based on some sort of status. And then even when you try to work outside of the roles, that you can feel this incredible pressure to come back into them because the roles are not just within us, but they're surrounding us. And so one of the things to think about this is that we hold these roles and some are intense and some are less intense. One of the most intense roles you can take on is the role of a parent. We have incredible expectations in terms of time, energy, and demands for parents. So role strain theory would say this is a role that you get and it has intense demands. And the problem with these roles is that it can often compete in its demands with others. So if you are a parent, you're supposed to be 100% available all the time, emotionally, physically, time, and money. That is kind of the expectation of quote unquote good parenting, to be available to our children. And of course, these things change over time. Expectations and norms of what parents are supposed to do vary, but this is the social norm we're in right now at this moment in time: intensive parenting. The problem with the intensive role of parent is that it's often in conflict with the intensive role of worker. So there is this argument that work and family are very greedy institutions. This is coming back from 1974 COSER. And that's the idea that families expect you to be there all the time and work expects you to be there all the time. These are two institutions that are incredibly greedy for your time and your energy. And so when you try to combine these two roles together, it can be really intense. This is why that combining work and family can be really difficult. The role of worker requires you to be unequivocally committed to work, no interruptions and no distractions. And the role of parent expects you to do the exact same. But the problem is you only have 24 hours in the day. So if you expect to be at work for 10 hours and you're supposed to be with your kid for 85 hours a day, it is impossible for you to do it all. And so what this does is this triggers role strain. It can be very difficult to combine these two roles because they're so intense. Family is intense, the role of mother is intense, and the role of father is intense. I'm just going to point out, however, that the role of mother is kind of different than the role of father. So we often talk, when we talk about role strain theory, about if you are a good father, quote, and I'm putting this in quotes, right? Traditionally good father, they're expected to be financial providers, to give to the family and to give more money, resources, and time. That role is exactly aligned with the role of being a good worker. So a good father is a breadwinner. A good worker is unequivocally committed to work. And so fathers who lean into their careers, and this is what the research shows, right? That after the birth of the child, fathers tend to increase their commitment. They increase their time at work. And that is perfectly aligned with this idea that a good father is a breadwinner. So these roles sit together, the demands sit together. But the problem is for mothers. Mothers are expected to be with their kids unconditionally, without any interruptions, and 100% available for them. But then if they work, they're expected to be at work 100% unequivocally available to work. And these two expectations are in conflict. Again, you might want different things in your family, but you are operating within systems that expect you to be 100% committed to your kid and 100% committed to your job. Does it feel difficult when you try to put them together? How are you experiencing this? Is this hard? Do you feel this innate feeling of strain when you look at how you're trying to combine your life if you're a mother, or versus how you're trying to combine your life if you're a father? And what does it look like if you're in a heterosexual couple and you're both operating within these different role sets? You're both operating within these different systems, one that expects the husband or father to be out and hustling at work, and one that expects the mother to be home with their children. You're in the systems. I'm in the systems. We're all in the systems. And maybe the goal is to disrupt the systems and create new systems. That's what I'm trying to do, each episode at a time. So we often think about this triggering role strain. It's difficult to combine these roles because they're so intense. So what does this mean for multiple children, right? Maybe actually if you just add that second child, well, you've already the Band-Aid's off, right? Like the damage is done. Maybe the big impact is coming from that first transition into parenthood, that first child, because that's adding a brand new role into your role set. Before you had that first child, you were not a parent. After that first child, you are now a parent. So maybe that's it, right? Like it just becomes really intense and it's demanding. And once you transition in, that's the end. And so then maybe that second child is less impactful. You've already made the adjustments, and these are big adjustments. And so this is where all those comments about second children being just tag-alongs to the first and some are less work could possibly be true. Like it's feasible. So what does the research show? Well, we conducted a study using Australian data to see what happens when parents have that transition into first and then into second births. And then what we did was we followed them over time. So we didn't just see what happened when they had that first transition. We looked as the kids got older, what happened? Was there a rebound? And what was interesting is we had 16 years of data, so we could look for a really long time. Now, of course, some parents in the sample had kids that were 2 or 3 or 4, but in theory, some of them had kids that ended up at 16 years old, right, or older, transitioned out. And what was interesting about this is we wanted to see what would happen when the second kids hit the scene. See, in Australia, it's much like the US. So the Australia and the US are the same, and that people tend to have multiple children. I've told you in a previous podcast, declining fertility, but on average, people want 2. So they want multiples. And so the second child is really common. And what we were interested in looking at was how children impacted parents' feelings of time pressure. The reason is that children are really demanding and they make us feel like we don't have enough time in the day. So we were interested in this link to having that first child and then having the second child, and then all of a sudden feeling this incredible time pressure, like there isn't enough time in the day. And we wanted to see how that increase or decrease in time pressure impacted parents' mental health. So what do we find? Prior to the birth, mothers and fathers reported pretty much the same level of time pressure. So before they had that first birth, they were both time pressed. But then once that first child is born, we saw that the time pressure increased for both parents, for mothers and fathers. But what we found was that the time pressure increase was twice that. It was significantly larger for mothers than fathers. It was twice the effect. And then what happened when the second children came is that it doubled it again. And that further widened the gap between mothers and fathers. And we hoped that actually over time, that time pressure that parents were feeling in having that first child, and again, mothers having twice as much as fathers, would diminish over time, that it would get less. Because in theory, you get more skills. You become a better parent and, you know what you're doing. You know how to put the diapers on. You don't put them on backwards anymore. You put them on the front way. You know that kids' meltdowns will pass. You know what first schools look like. You know what these kind of transitions look like. And then the other thing that we thought might diminish the time pressure is that eventually the kids will enter school. And so the demand on parents should decrease, right? The time pressure and the demands on parents should decrease. But what we found was that that didn't happen. The time pressure lingered. It stayed. It didn't return to baseline. It was higher once that first child hit the scene. And then it was double with a second. And it didn't decline. Part of that could be that, you start to put your kids into activities, that you start to pick up an incredible amount of other demands as children get older. I will tell you, I have a teenage daughter right now, and I have never experienced so much demand on my time, energy, and bank account than when she turned 14. What we also thought was maybe that what was happening was it was just those working full-time work were the ones who were experiencing this incredible time pressure. Like maybe it's just those who have the most on. They had full-time work or they were doing the housework, and that would be what was driving this increase in time pressure. It wasn't what we found. We found that the time pressure went up because of the babies showing up and the kids being present, and not necessarily because you were working full-time or you were doing more work. We found that time pressure increased with the first and the second children for all parents, and this was true whether they were working or not. And so reducing work to part-time was not necessarily the solution for this time pressure problem. Of course, you're wondering, what happened to those who had third children? It didn't matter. The time pressure was there. And this is showing that children actually don't function like economies of scale. The other thing we're interested in understanding is what are the health implications of parents' increased time pressure on their mental health? Let me be clear that mental health following the birth of a child is complex, it's personal, and it's very challenging for many new mothers. I'm not trying to dismiss that experience in any way, shape, or form. That is real and serious and something that we should shine a brighter light on and provide more supports for. What I'm talking about is the measure of mental health that can include some of these components. Postpartum depression might contribute to some of the worst mental health that we're seeing in the study. But it's not the only piece. It'll be one piece amongst many. Let me tell you a little bit about how we measured it here. So there's this mental health inventory, and we use the short form. It's self-reported, and it asks people in the past 4 weeks, have you felt like a nervous person, so down in the dumps that nothing could cheer you up, calm and peaceful, down, and a happy person? Postpartum depression may contribute to some of this, of course, but it may be one piece, but not the whole piece. And what we found was that for mothers, on average, mental health improves with the first child immediately following the birth, and that remains steady over the next few years. But with the second child, their mental health sharply declines, and it remains low. The reason, in part, is that second children intensify mothers' feeling of time pressure. And we show that actually, if you could reduce some of that time pressure, if they didn't have that intensity coming with the second child, that we actually could see that their mental health would actually improve with motherhood, on average. Fathers get a mental health boost with the first child, but they also see their mental health decline with the second. But unlike mothers, fathers' mental health plateaus over time. And of course, mother's mental health following the birth of the child is complex. There's many factors contributing to it. But what we're showing is that fathers aren't necessarily facing the same chronic pressure that mothers are feeling over the long term. It's the challenge of getting 2 children ready in the morning, feeding 2 kids, dropping them at 2 different locations, making sure one ends up at soccer lessons and one ends up at music, making sure everyone's doing the homework. It's that constant churn of making it all happen that is stressful. It's not the children themselves. So, is this a misperception that second children are less work than the first? And do second children make life more stressful for parents? The answer is yes. Second children bring this added time pressure that is associated with a reduction in mental health. And that's what makes doing parenthood difficult. It doesn't get easier over time, and the demands remain because children will still need to do their homework, or they'll still need to go to practice, or they'll still need to learn the recorder. So maybe parents aren't taking as many photos of their second children because they're so damn tired, because second children are actually increasing the time pressure, not because second children are bad children in any way, shape, or form, but it is just the expectation we're doing it all, and we're doing it all alone in the absence of social supports, and we're doing it all, and we have to do a lot. It's important for children to be everywhere all at the same time so that they can grow up to be wonderful, competent, high-skilled adults. That is creating a time pressure and a time pressure on mothers. Second children, I'm sorry you didn't get your photos taken, but it may just be that your parents are exhausted. So what does this mean for you? Should you only have one child? Well, maybe if it feels like too much of a demand, right? There's no shame in having one. But if you want to have multiple, know that this is what may be coming for you. You may need more support to get everyone where they need to be. And if you live in a country that's highly individualistic, that support falls on the parents, and especially on the mothers at the expense of their well-being. Is there another way to do this? Are we trapped in this expectation? I mean, of course, you could have whole communities working together to make sure that kids are safe and where they need to be. It seems feasible, or other countries are able to create a culture that nurtures the kids and keeps them safe. But we have to work together to build trust and safety to support us all. So, as per usual, thank you so much for listening to Misperceived, where you don't need a PhD, you just get to hang out with me. And I'm sorry to the second and third children in the room. I'm one of you. I feel it. This podcast was produced with the support of the incredible Sophie Squires, the wonderful Kate Danger, the fantastic Rich Berner, and the one and only, the best ever made, Serena Reagan. I would like to acknowledge that our podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today.